The Fairy and the Prince's Moonlit Journey. The winter woods were an endless expanse of skeletal trees and ghostly snow, where silence reigned and shadows seemed alive. Prince Kael, clad in a cloak as dark as the night, pushed through the frigid winds that bit at his face. His steed had faltered miles ago, refusing to take another step into the eerie depths of the forest, leaving Kael to journey on foot. The cold gnawed at his resolve, but his desperation outweighed his exhaustion. It had been weeks since Elara's slumber, her breath faint, and her beauty preserved as if she were frozen in a single moment of time. Physicians had come and gone, each leaving behind somber expressions and empty reassurances. Rumors whispered of curses and ancient magics, but no solution seemed within reach, until Kael had heard the tale of the winter woods. It was said that those who wandered deep enough might find more than frost and shadows. They might find answers, though seldom the ones they sought. The snow crunched beneath his boots, each step an act of willpower. As he approached a massive, ancient oak with roots that clawed at the earth like frozen fingers, a voice reached him. It was soft, delicate, yet carried the weight of an eternity. "Prince Kael," it said, weaving his name into the wind. Kael froze, his hand instinctively gripping the hilt of his sword. The voice did not sound threatening, but neither did it promise safety. "Who speaks?" he called, his breath a plume of frost. The air shimmered before him, and from the branches of the oak descended a figure no taller than his forearm. Her wings, translucent and edged with silver light, fluttered softly as if they moved to a rhythm only she could hear. She was clad in threads of starlight and moonbeam, her hair cascading like spun silver. "I am Lyra," she said, her voice calm yet charged with an otherworldly resonance. "And I have awaited you." Kael's grip on his sword loosened, though his wariness remained. "Awaited me? Why? How do you know my name?" Lyra drifted closer, her glow illuminating the harsh lines of his face. "The winds carried your sorrow, Prince, and the moon saw your longing. You seek to wake the princess, do you not? To break the slumber that binds her soul to the edge of existence." Kael nodded, his throat tight. "If you know of her plight, then you must also know how to save her." Lyra's gaze was piercing, her luminous eyes reflecting secrets of the universe. "To wake the princess, you must gather the essence of the moon itself. It is a task few would dare, and fewer still have survived." "What must I do?" Kael asked, his desperation sharpening his voice. Lyra's wings quivered, scattering faint motes of light. "You must follow me, Prince, to the edges of the mortal world and beyond. The moon's essence is scattered, hidden in places where time bends and the veil between realms grows thin. You will face your fears, your regrets, and truths you have buried deep within your heart." Her words were heavy, each syllable a weight Kael felt settle on his shoulders. Yet he could not falter. Not when Elara's life hung in the balance. "I will do whatever it takes," he said firmly. "Lead me." A flicker of something, pity perhaps, crossed Lyra's face before it vanished. "Very well. But know this, Prince. The journey will demand more than courage. To succeed, you must be willing to sacrifice." Without another word, Lyra turned, her wings casting a trail of light that lit their path. Kael followed, his heart a tumult of hope and dread. The winter woods seemed to shift as they moved, the trees whispering in voices too faint to understand. Shadows danced just beyond the edge of Kael's vision, and the air grew heavier, charged with an otherworldly energy. As they ventured deeper, Lyra's light grew brighter, revealing an ancient path carved into the frozen earth. The oak behind them disappeared into the darkness, and Kael realized there was no turning back. For the first time, he felt the enormity of the journey ahead. Not just its danger, but the secrets it might unearth about himself, about Elara, and about the forces that had bound them to this moment. And in the distance, faint yet unmistakable, the moon began to rise. The path Lyra led him on twisted like a serpent, vanishing into shadows and reappearing in faint glimmers of light. The deeper they ventured, the colder the air grew, yet Kael felt a strange pull, a force beyond mere curiosity that urged him onward. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time in the winter would seem to stretch and fold, denying the prince any sense of its passage. Lyra, ever ethereal, darted ahead, her silver glow piercing the encroaching darkness. Then, without warning, the forest ended. Kael stepped out onto a clearing dominated by an immense lake, its surface as still and reflective as polished glass. The moon, pale and enormous, hung directly overhead, casting its light across the water. Yet something about the lake felt wrong. "This," Lyra said, her voice softer now, "is the Midnight Lake. Beneath its surface lies the tear of Lunara, the first fragment of moonlight you must claim." Kael took a step closer, but the ground seemed to hum beneath his boots, as if protesting his presence. "And how am I to retrieve it?" he asked. Lyra turned, her expression unreadable. "You must pass through the veil." She gestured toward the water, and as she did, a ripple spread across its surface. The air above the lake shimmered, revealing a translucent barrier that pulsed like a living thing. The veil separates your world from the realm of memories. To claim the tear, you must step through it and face what it shows you. Kael's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. "And what exactly will it show me?" "Truths," Lyra said simply. "The pieces of yourself you've buried, the mistakes you refuse to acknowledge, the regrets you carry, even if you do not name them." Kael's chest tightened. He had no illusions about his past. He knew the weight of his failures, even if he rarely spoke of them. Yet to face them head-on, to confront them in some otherworldly realm. "Will I survive it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That," Lyra replied, "depends on the strength of your soul." With no other choice, Kael stepped forward. The lake's surface was unnaturally warm against his boots, the ripples licking at his feet as he waded in. The veil shimmered before him, a translucent wall that hummed with energy. He hesitated for the briefest moment, then pushed through. The world shifted. Kael found himself standing in a grand hall he recognized all too well, the ballroom of his family's castle. Chandeliers hung above, their crystals refracting light like shards of a shattered star. The room was filled with spectral figures, their faces familiar yet indistinct, as if drawn from a dream. At the center of it all stood Elara. She was radiant, dressed in a gown of silver and blue, her laughter like music that filled the hall. Yet as Kael moved closer, the scene changed. Elara's smile faded, her eyes filled with hurt as she turned toward him. "Why did you leave me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kael stopped in his tracks. I didn't leave you," he stammered, though the words felt hollow. The scene shifted again. He saw himself standing by a window, staring out into the stormy night as Elara begged him to stay. But his younger self, proud and brash, turned away from her, leaving her alone in the cold, empty hall. "It was my duty," Kael whispered, though no one seemed to hear him. "The war demanded my attention. I thought she would understand." "Did you truly think of her at all?" a voice echoed, low and accusing. Kael turned to see a figure cloaked in shadows, its form twisting like smoke. It spoke with his own voice, its words piercing like daggers. "You left her not for duty, but for fear. Fear of what it meant to be vulnerable. Fear of being tied to someone who needed you." "Enough!" Kael roared, his hand gripping his sword. But the blade, so steady in his grasp before, now felt insubstantial, as if it were made of mist. The shadow loomed closer. "You can fight me, Prince, but you cannot escape the truth. You failed her." Kael fell to his knees, the weight of the accusation suffocating him. But then, faint and delicate as a single snowflake, Lyra's voice reached him. "Remember why you are here," she whispered. "Not to fight the past, but to claim the future." With a surge of determination, Kael forced himself to stand. The spectres faded, and the shadow dissolved into the air. Beneath his feet, the floor turned back into the still waters of the lake. In the distance, a faint glow beckoned. Kael dove forward, reaching for the light. It burned against his palm as he grasped it, and the world around him dissolved into white. When Kael opened his eyes, he was back on the lake's shore. In his hand was a crystalline tear that glowed with a soft, silvery light. Lyra hovered nearby, her glow dimmer than before. "You have passed the first trial," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But the journey ahead will only grow harder." Kael clenched the tear tightly, his jaw set. "I will see this through." For her. Lyra nodded, though her expression remained somber. The moon above seemed dimmer now, as if it too had been drained by the trial. And so they pressed on, the lake vanishing into the distance as the forest reclaimed them. The path to the Lunar Ridge was steep and treacherous, carved through jagged rocks and slick with frost. The moon hung low in the sky, its light dim and cold, casting shadows that moved in ways they should not have. Kael walked in silence, clutching the tear of Lunara, its faint glow his only companion apart from Lyra's soft, flickering presence. "What lies ahead?" he asked, breaking the quiet. His voice sounded small, swallowed by the expanse of the mountains. Lyra fluttered ahead, her wings trailing faint glimmers of light. "The second fragment of moonlight lies within the ridge of stars," she said. "It is a map, shattered long ago when the heavens wept. You must repair it to guide us to the peak where the moon's essence awaits." Kael frowned. "A shattered map? And what will it demand of me this time?" Lyra's light dimmed slightly, her voice tinged with caution. "The shards are fragments of lost stars. They hold the weight of celestial secrets and the echoes of those who failed before you. To claim them, you must confront the judgment of the ridge itself." Kael tightened his grip on the tear, its glow pulsing faintly, as though it sensed the challenge to come. "Judgment," he muttered. "It seems this journey is less about the moon and more about my soul." Lyra turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps they are one and the same." As they climbed, the air grew thinner, each breath a struggle. The ridge loomed ahead, a jagged expanse of obsidian rock, its surface dotted with tiny shards that glimmered like glass in the faint moonlight. The wind howled, carrying whispers that Kael couldn't understand yet couldn't ignore. At the center of the ridge lay a hollow, its edges lined with fragments that shimmered with unearthly light. Kael approached cautiously, the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on him. Lyra landed softly on his shoulder. "The map must be whole for us to proceed. You will find the pieces scattered across the ridge, but beware. Each one holds a memory of those who came before you." Kael nodded, steeling himself. He reached for the first shard, a piece no larger than his palm, its surface smooth and cold. As his fingers closed around it, the world shifted. He stood in a throne room he didn't recognize, surrounded by figures cloaked in shadow. A man knelt before a throne, his voice a rasping plea. "I did all you asked. I sacrificed everything. Why do you deny me the final step?" The figure on the throne, faceless yet imposing, spoke in a voice that echoed with power. "Your heart was not pure. You sought the moon's light for yourself, not for others. You failed the ridge's judgment." Kael blinked, and the vision dissolved. In his hand, the shard glowed faintly, a soft warmth emanating from its core. He placed it in the hollow at the center of the ridge, where it snapped into place with a flash of light. "Only those who seek for others will pass," Lyra said softly, her tone heavy with meaning. "The ridge remembers." Kael pressed on, gathering shards one by one. Each piece revealed another failure. Another soul who had sought the moonlight but been undone by their own flaws. A warrior blinded by pride. A scholar consumed by greed. A lover crippled by doubt. With each shard, Kael felt the weight of their story settle on his shoulders. Their failures mirrored his own fears. Their struggles a grim reflection of the journey he now faced. As he approached the final shard, Kael felt a shift in the air. The wind stilled, and the whispers grew louder, forming words that cut through the silence. "Why do you seek the light, Prince Kael? To save her, or to redeem yourself?" The question hit him like a blow. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the shard. "I seek it for her," he said, his voice firm but trembling at the edges. "For Elara, to undo the wrongs I have done." The air grew colder, the shadows deepening. "And if she does not wake? If this journey ends in failure?" Kael closed his eyes, the weight of the question pressing on his chest. "Then I will carry her memory, and I will carry this failure. But I must try." The shadows receded, and the shard's light flared brightly. Kael grasped it, the warmth spreading through his hand and into his chest. He placed it in the hollow, and the map flared to life. The shards, now whole, formed a glowing constellation that hovered above the ridge. It pulsed with an inner light, casting beams that pointed toward the peak of the mountain. "You have passed the judgment of the ridge," Lyra said, her voice quiet but filled with a rare note of pride. "The path to the peak is now clear." Kael exhaled, the tension in his chest easing. Yet as he looked up at the glowing map, a sense of unease lingered. The ridge had judged him worthy, but he knew the hardest trials were yet to come. The light of the map illuminated their path as they continued, the moon above watching silently, its glow growing ever fainter. The path from the ridge of stars to the moonlit peak was bathed in an eerie stillness. The air was thin and bitterly cold. Each breath Kael took a jagged shard in his lungs. The glowing constellation of the star map hovered above him, its beams of light unwavering in their guidance. Lyra's glow had dimmed even further, her fragile wings barely carrying her as she flitted beside him. As they ascended, the moon grew closer, its surface luminous but fractured, like a silver mirror splintered by an unseen hand. The peak loomed ahead, an expanse of polished stone that shimmered faintly as though it absorbed and reflected the moon's essence. "This is the Glade of Echoes," Lyra whispered, her voice carrying a solemn weight. "Here, the moon will test the truth of your heart. Its light will reveal your innermost self, your fears, your doubts, and your intentions. If you falter, the path will end here." Kael tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, though he knew it would be of no use. And if I succeed? Lyra met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then the moon's essence will be yours to claim. But tread carefully, Prince. Not all who face their reflections emerge whole. The glade shimmered as Kael stepped into its center. The moment his boots touched the stone, the air around him shifted, rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. The star map above flickered and disappeared, leaving him bathed in pale moonlight. The light coalesced before him, forming a figure, familiar yet wrong. It was Elara, her silver gown trailing behind her, her eyes filled with an otherworldly glow. But as she stepped closer, Kael realized there was something hollow in her gaze, something distant and accusatory. "Why have you come, Kael?" the apparition asked, its voice a perfect echo of Elara's, yet laced with an edge of disdain. Kael swallowed hard, his heart pounding. "To save you, to bring you back." The apparition tilted its head, a cruel smile playing on its lips. "Is that the truth? Or is it guilt that drives you? Guilt for abandoning me when I needed you most?" Kael faltered. I made mistakes, but I loved you, Elara. I still do." The apparition's laugh was sharp and hollow, cutting through the stillness. "Love or regret? Do you seek to save me or to absolve yourself?" Before Kael could respond, more figures emerged from the moonlight. Each one bore Elara's face, yet they were subtly different. One wept, tears streaking her cheeks. Another glared, her eyes filled with anger. A third stood silent, her gaze vacant and lifeless. They circled him, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusations. "You left me. You failed me. You don't deserve to save me." Kael dropped to his knees, the weight of their words pressing down on him like a physical force. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. Were these visions the moon's truth, or his own deepest fears given form? "Enough!" he shouted, his voice raw. "I know I failed. I know I hurt you. But I cannot undo the past. All I can do is fight for the future. For you. For us." The figures paused, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. One stepped forward, her face softening, her voice gentle. "And if you fail again? If this journey ends as all the others did?" Kael looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Then I will carry that failure. I will bear it for the rest of my life, but I will not stop trying. You are worth every risk, every pain, every trial." The figure studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then rise, Prince Kael." The moonlight brightened, the figures dissolving into silver mist. At the center of the glade, a glowing orb began to form, its light pulsating like a heartbeat. Kael stood, his legs unsteady but his resolve firm. Lyra's voice, faint and distant, reached him. "The moon has accepted your truth. The essence is yours." Kael approached the orb, its light warm and radiant. As he reached out, it surged toward him, wrapping around his hand and sinking into his chest. The warmth spread through his body, filling him with a sense of peace and purpose. When the light faded, the glade was quiet once more. Lyra hovered nearby, her form now barely visible, her glow faint as a dying star. "You have done what few ever could," she said softly, her voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "But the final step remains. The essence must be delivered to the altar before the moon wanes completely." Kael nodded, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. The journey was nearing its end, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on him. He glanced at Lyra, her fragile form trembling in the cold wind. "Will you be all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Lyra smiled faintly, her light flickering. "Do not worry for me, Prince. My purpose is nearly fulfilled. Focus on what lies ahead." With a heavy heart, Kael turned and began the final climb, the moonlight guiding his steps. Behind him, the glade of echoes faded into the shadows, its trials now a memory. The summit of the mountain was unlike anything Kael had seen before. A vast expanse of gleaming white stone that seemed to rise and fall like the surface of a frozen sea. The moon loomed directly above, its fractured light bathing the peak in an otherworldly glow. In the center of the summit stood the Lunar Altar, an ancient structure of silver and crystal, its edges adorned with runes that shimmered faintly as if alive. Kael's breath caught as he approached. The altar radiated an overwhelming presence, a hum that resonated deep within his chest. The orb of moonlight he carried pulsed in response, as though recognizing its place of origin. Lyra hovered beside him, her light flickering weakly, her wings barely moving. Her once radiant form was now almost translucent, and Kael could see the strain etched into her delicate features. "This is it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Lunar Altar is the only place where the moon's essence can be offered. You must act quickly. Time is slipping away." Kael glanced at the sky. The moon's edges were beginning to blur, its light dimming as shadows crept across its surface. Midnight was near, and with it, the end of their journey. He stepped toward the altar, but as he did, the air grew heavy. The hum deepened, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the air. "Prince Kael," it intoned, ancient and inscrutable. "You stand at the edge of eternity, bearing the light of the heavens. Before you proceed, one final truth must be revealed." Kael froze, his heart pounding. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, its tone neither kind nor cruel. "What truth?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The runes on the altar flared, their light converging into a single point above the structure. From this point emerged a figure, tall, ethereal, and cloaked in silver radiance. It bore no face, yet its presence was overwhelming, a manifestation of the moon's will. You seek to save another, the figure said, its voice layered with echoes. Yet in doing so, you have carried not only her burden, but your own. The weight of your guilt, your regret, and your doubt threatens to consume the light you bear. Kael clenched his fists. I have faced my past. I have passed every trial. I am here now because I refuse to let her suffer for my mistakes. The figure tilted its head, its light pulsing. And yet, the essence you hold demands more than resolve. It demands a sacrifice. To awaken the princess, you must offer a piece of yourself, your strength, your light, your very soul. Are you prepared to pay this price? Kael hesitated. He looked at Lyra, her fragile form trembling in the cold wind. Her journey had been one of sacrifice, every step costing her a fragment of the light that gave her life. And now, it was his turn to decide. I will give whatever is needed, he said, his voice resolute. If it means saving her, I will pay the price. The figure extended a hand, pointing to the altar. Then place the essence upon the lunar seal, and let your heart guide the offering. Kael stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He placed the orb of moonlight onto the center of the altar, where the runes immediately flared to life. The light spread outward, forming a radiant cocoon around the structure. As the light grew brighter, Kael felt a searing pain in his chest. It was as if the essence was pulling at his very being, drawing something intangible from within him. His vision blurred, and he fell to his knees, gasping for breath. Through the haze, he saw Lyra approach, her glow faint but steady. She knelt beside him, her voice soft and full of kindness. Your strength will sustain her, she said, her wings fluttering weakly. But your light will guide her back. Kael looked at her, his vision fading. Lyra, will I survive this? She smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression. You will endure, Prince, though you may never be the same. The light you give will leave its mark, but it will not break you. With a final surge of effort, Kael pressed his hands against the altar. The light flared, blinding and all-consuming, and for a moment, the world was silent. When the light faded, Kael collapsed, his body weak but alive. He opened his eyes to see Elara standing before him, her gown shimmering like moonlight, her eyes wide with wonder. Kael, she whispered, her voice trembling. He reached for her, his hand brushing hers. You're awake, he said, his voice hoarse but filled with relief. Elara knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. You saved me. Above them, the moon shone brighter than ever, its fractured surface now whole. Lyra's voice, faint and distant, echoed on the wind. Cherish this light, Prince, she said, her presence fading into the night. For it was born of sacrifice. As Kael held Elara close, the lunar altar dissolved into the mountain, its purpose fulfilled. And though the night was still, the moon's glow carried a quiet promise that the sacrifices made beneath its light would never be forgotten.